Hey, thanks for dropping by. I haven't posted in a while, so I thought I'd put something up. No board games today, no D&D games today, so I thought I would share you one of my hobbies. So one of the things I enjoy doing is sculpting, and I sculpt D&D terrain, bits of tiles, traps, critters, and one of the things I particularly like to do is these bottle cap markers. So I call them bottle cap markers because I usually sculpt them on the back of a bottle cap. It's easier to hold them. And when you're sculpting with wet material or sculpting material, it's easier to work on the miniature if it's attached to something that you're not constantly touching. Like if I were to sculpt like this, it would never get done. So the material that I use is two kinds, and one of them is Super Sculpey. That's this stuff here. Super Sculpey. And then a slightly harder version. I forgot what it's called, but it's gray. Gray Super Sculpey. And so the difference is that gray Super Sculpey comes out, it's harder to press and work with, but that's good because it doesn't get as malleable, and it's easier to make sharp edges. Like, it's easier to make defined characteristics on the figure. So here is a D&D marker I was working on right here. And I'll show you the difference between this and the regular Super Sculpey. Here we go. Regular Super Sculpey. Oops. There we go. Regular Super Sculpey. It's too malleable when you're trying to work it. So you end up with a lot of rounded edges. See that? It looks like claymation work, right? So the gray stuff is easier to work with. It doesn't get as squishy, and you can get very defined edges on it. So here's two things from recent sculpts, and they are markers that you'd play with on a board if you don't want to play with figures. Since there's really no facing in D&D, and the more complicated games like In the Labyrinth, the Fantasy Trip, there's a Kickstart that Steve Jackson game that's got facing, and for that I would use figures. But for D&D, you don't need to do that. But it's still fun. Here's a wizard. And he's got a little hat on there. And then there's a knight. So the way I do this is I start out with a plug of Sculpey. I'll just go like this. And this is not enough to fit on a bottle cap. Basically, you work it with your hands. You flatten it out, make it into a ball, and then basically just press it onto a bottle cap, flip it over, and you have something to start working with. So it's easier to start with a plug of cold pink Sculpey. The gray stuff is much easier, like I said earlier. So then I have some kind of vision in mind for the sculpt. So what I do is I pre-craft pieces like this, and I set it down on the background. See, you can see in the light that there are imperfections in this. So part of the process here, it's not really even. So part of the process is getting it even so that I can fire it up when it's done and have a nice hard finished product. Super Sculpey is amazing because it drives to ceramic quality, and you could drill it, paste it, paint it, and don't have any painted ones here, but that's okay. So what I do is I craft the initial pieces separately, and then I simply push them down into the Sculpey here, and then I'll use a tool to, that looks infantile, then I'll use a tool to scrape the edges. So I'll just give you what I mean. I scrape the edges down like this. This is not a good tool. So this gives the illusion of the sculpt being part of the base as opposed to being plunked down on the base. So here's a little spaceship that I have here somewhere, unless I dropped it. Here, this guy here. It's looks like it's made out of one piece, not plunked down over the back. It doesn't look so good. But anyway, so I do these. I do most of my sculpting for science fiction miniatures. For Space Game, I play Starmada and a few others, and I really enjoy them. So I thought about it. I didn't want to go out and spend $20-30 on 5 figures, so I decided to I'll use my counters, I'll use my bottle cap sculpts, and they'll look good. After they're painted, they look much better. So I didn't want to it takes about a half an hour to sculpt something pretty well, and it still looks presentable. But instead of sculpting each one, spending a half hour of my life, and I didn't want to do that. So what I did was I looked into casting. So here's a mold of this guy right here. Right, fits in there. So this material is 2-part silicone, and it comes in 2 bottles, and you take a plug of each, about equal, and you roll it together, and you put it down again, except you put it down inside a bottle cap. You stuff it all in there. See, like this. This was done inside a bottle cap. And that gives it support on all sides. Then what you do is, this stuff dries, this stuff starts to set in about 3 minutes. So you work it, and you jam it into the bottle cap, and then you find a sculpt that you really want, like this, and you jam it into the still setting silicone, and then you let the mold sit for about 20 minutes, and then you have a usable mold. So these molds are pretty reusable. If you're going to do casting with acrylic, which is what this is, I didn't sand it down. It's plain old sandpaper will take care of the edges. And see if I can get a good focus. You can make, I don't know, 15, 20, 30. I've not worn out of them yet. But you can cast with acrylic, pourable acrylic, or you can actually take Sculpey like this, get it warm, jam it into the figure, jam it into the mold, and it will take the shape, and then you carefully peel back the mold, and you take that Sculpey thing that you pressed into the mold, and you stick it in the oven. Sculpey cooks at, let me get the instructions here. Sculpey cooks at about 15 minutes per quarter inch of depth. So this guy right here will, like all of the things here, all of these, it's less than a quarter of an inch, so I put it in for 15 minutes. If you leave it in too long, it turns dark brown, cool color, but they become very brittle. So I want to show you some of the other things that I made. that I'm sort of proud of. You know, it's goofy looking. These are the space stations. And you also use space stations and asteroids and so forth in Starmada. So here's a couple of space stations. They look pretty cool. Not so bad. And, oh, here's another guy here. Very stylized. Here's this. The Trek ships. Trek ships. These are really old casts. These are really old sculpts. These are the stuff that I worked on, that I designed when I first started working on this about 7 years ago. But hey, they sell pretty well on eBay. People like them, I guess, and I don't charge much for them, so I will keep selling them. Here's more space stations. Here is a really old Klingon sculpt. I have some better ones upstairs, but I didn't bring them downstairs. So now, these guys, you can actually drill a small hole in right there and put them on a stand and paint them. And, you know, you don't have to pay $5-7 for a Star Trek figure. You can just make it. You could just make them. And I can sell them on eBay for about, I guess I'd sell about this many for about $5. So it's an interesting hobby. I hope you enjoyed the video. I thank you for letting me share my hobby with you, and we'll see you soon.